transnational dimension of some of these shows, that they do get exported to other countries, and what, if we were to extend this discussion of, how religion is within other transnational communities, what happens there?
I think that would be a terrific study. I would hope somebody will do that. I haven't actually looked at that in terms of how it plays internationally.
Yeah, I was just wondering.
We talked about that a little bit in the last panel, the extent to which television texts are exported, and that they do have the role that they play in the international marketplace does have a lot to do with the dynamics that drive the finances of particular programs. So, and Lost has been successful in various places around the world. So, I don't know if you want to comment about
on the internationalization of these. I'm trying to think of these. The shows that I was talking about, as far as I know, they weren't international hits for whatever reason. Yeah, so I can't comment.
Well, I'm actually writing on something along those lines and arguing that shows like Heroes and Lost couch very much in terms of international audience, solely for the casting, Asian characters, Heroes, my question is another direction. There seems to be a pattern emerging in the discourse surrounding each of these panels so far, a little bit maybe lacking this one, and that is problematizing and troubling discussion in a constructive way. I think the first panel had Sarah Renee Weiss brought in the notion of consumerism, how that was perhaps divided and not addressed as much as might have been, and my panel was attacked, my critique, let's say, for positioning perhaps in relation to material, and John Caldwell addressed institutional analysis, and what's missing for me perhaps a little bit, I guess mainly in the discussion, from my end, just may come across here as curmudgeonly, and that's okay, but my house, so I speak for this too, is that I'm quite disturbed by this whole internet fan mania. I see this media. And you, in your approach, is kind of just to throw it out there and broach it, and create it as a fact of life, which it is. It's not going to go away. It's cause it to do so. But we've gone from the water cooler discussion of television to the total obsession, not everyone's niche group. But I just wondered if you might address, in a sense, what that means as a logic.
Well, yeah, you raise a good point. Yeah, and that well, I think you raise a good point that's in the paper that I didn't speak about here, which is that we do have to look at who has access to actually contributing to these kinds of online discussions, because that in order to participate in that kind of online fandom, you have to have a certain amount of free time and you have to have a certain amount of capital in order to have access to the online realm to begin with. And so what ends up happening, I think, is to the extent that when Henry Jenkins argues about convergence culture, he sort of celebrates the fact that people online are being heard, and therefore, fans are in a sense contributing to the direction that shows take. And I think that if we keep in mind the fact that this is a really elite audience of people who are contributing, that then kind of drives that argument about how there is a real sense in which the programs that emerge are coming out of a type of market research that is pretty skewed toward the elites and toward certain reinforcement of norms or certain ways of seeing perspectives.
I think it goes beyond that. He talks about more than just in terms of elites. He talks about democratization of media, which for me is absurd. Again, that's my curmudgeonly take on it.
I was just, if I could just add to addressing the question kind of on top of Lynn's answer, I do think that while the political economy of this all is extremely important and foundational, and that we probably need to talk more about kind of the exploited, uncompensated labor that goes into these blogs and fan sites and so forth that support major conglomerates, There also, I think it's also important to recognize that we shouldn't limit it to the political economic in terms of talking about the kind of important cultural politics that occur via those type of websites. And I think specifically of the ways in which people who feel historically marginalized have been able to fairly successfully interact with television showrunners, producers, and so forth to talk about the development of characters that are important, for example, to the identity politics. So you have people that, for example, are interacting with science fiction. I have a student that recently completed a project I thought was fascinating. She was talking about how people on LiveJournal, for example, were interacting actually with people that were creating Battlestar Galactica, talking about the gender positions and gender politics of the various characters on that program. And there was actually a listening and a back and forth between the fan community and the producers of the program. And so, is that unproblematic? Absolutely not. But I think there's a cultural politics, again, that escapes political economic analysis, as sufficient to evaluate those type of interactions.
I've been given the time signal, and I want to get the one last question, but I also want to get at this too. With my students, I'm a fellow Facebook user. You can figure out what lost character you are, for instance. So there's those communities. And also in my research where I'm looking at like serial killer forensic dramas, I was interested in Millennium with Lance Hendrickson, which has been off the air for ages. What I was surprised to find is the community that still exists around Millennium, an online community that writes out the stories, even though the show has been off the air for years. It continues to this day in the fan base. So, as far as the possibilities and now especially the internet generates as far as the community and what that does when you think about kind of religious connections and spirituality, it's just startling, really. One last quick question.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I really appreciate Elijah, your focus on production in particular. I was curious if your bigger project actually addresses, you're talking about auteur theory and kind of navigating it over to television studies in some way. But I'm wondering if your larger project really considers the broader idea of authorship in terms of the ensemble, screenwriters, directors, all the elements and components, which I think is what nails film theory, is that it also doesn't take that into consideration. Right. But does your larger project go there?
It does, yeah. I mean, it's absolutely. Just the same problems in film theory is even more apparent, I think, in TV. But so far I kind of want to build TV, the auteur theory applied to TV up before it's torn down. And I use Tom Fontana as a good example. And in fact, in my paper, I also argue kind of what happens when Oz, at least, Tom Fontana wrote every single episode. It aired 57 episodes, and he wrote, or at least co-wrote, every single one. And I think that actually has some problems with the show. I think that's why the show wasn't as strong as it could have been, because it's just sort of him talking to himself in some episodes, just seeing that. So in that case, it's the problem is not so much with auteur theory, but with when one writer is too much of an auteur, at least in this particular. Whereas St. Elsewhere and Homicide were more collaborative. He wasn't the creator of the characters originally. He was the showrunner, the producer for a long time. So that's another thing that I talk about in my larger project. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. I believe there's refreshments in the back.